Hello, everyone. Hope y'all are doing well. Here to continue our discussion. We progress now into the kingdom Plantae. So let me get in here. So up to this point, you should be very familiar with the Protistan group. We look at the algae. So algae are believed to be the precursors to modern plants. So if you remember a little bit about the green algae, the freshwater forms, they seem to be very closely phylogenetically to modern plants. We get into a category that I'm pretty sure you're familiar with. I'd be very shocked if you didn't know what a plant was. Right? Plants are quite abundant. I think even a third grader knows what a plant is. A kindergartner knows what a plant is. So I'm not here to teach you what a plant is. We are going to discuss some taxonomy, but I want to get a little bit more into the ecology of plants. They do have a lot of interesting ecology and biology associated with them. So when we get into Kingdom Plantae, I want you to have this sort of context. I'm sure y'all have been at this point, at some point in your life, you've been injured, you've been sick, you've been immobile. You couldn't really move. You were, just bedridden. It's quite frustrating, and it's not very, pleasant. But we know that it's temporary, right? You're going to heal. You're going to get better. You're going to recover, and then you're going to be able to walk and run and play, whatever you do. Yeah. So plants, on the other hand, they are basically stuck at one spot for their whole life, right? So some of you struggle with the COVID quarantine. Oh no, I can't go anywhere, right? What if you're a plant? Literally, you're stuck in one spot, you're rooted to the spot, and you're gonna spend your entire life in that area. So anything and everything that plants do, understand they're doing literally stuck in that one singular location. So it makes it quite interesting, quite amazing that they can carry out their entire life processes in that singular point, right? If weather gets bad, we can move to safety, right? If it's hot, we can go to the shade. If it's cold, we can step out into the sun. If you're a plant, you don't have those freedoms, those abilities, right? You're stuck in that spot, enduring anything and everything that Mother Nature throws your way. So that's going to be a big sort of focal point when we get to the ecology of these plants. Right? Let's get a little bit into some taxonomy first. So this is taxonomically what makes a plant a plant. We know that they are eukaryotic celled. They are going to have a protective cell wall made up of cellulose. So cellulose is a polysaccharide, very difficult to digest. So it's a good protective molecule that plants use. Plants will be photosynthetic with two types of chlorophylls, chlorophyll alpha, chlorophyll beta. After they undergo photosynthesis, they can store excess glucose into the form of starch. So the presence of starch on the inside, cellulose around the outside of the cell, two very distinctive types of polysaccharides is what plants really rely on here for survival, for nutrition. And I'm not going to get too much into the alternation of generations. It's just, just different vocabulary that botanists use. Plants are going to progress from what we call a sporophyte generation, a multicellular diploid, and then this odd gametophyte generation, a multicellular haploid. So humans don't do this, right? You and I, we are, if we were plants, we would be considered sporophytes. We are multicellular, made up of trillions of cells, and our cells are diploid, have all the genetic components there. We don't undergo this level that plants do. So humans, animals at the multicellular diploid state would produce then these gametes, these haploid gametes. What plants do, they undergo this gametophyte generation where they produce spores, and the haploid cells undergo mitosis. So that's weird. It'd be like kind of weird. Doesn't really work like this, but let's say someone's eggs start undergoing mitosis. Someone's sperm starts to undergo mitosis. It doesn't happen like that for humans. So just some odd vocabulary in case if I mention it, in case you hear it or read it in the book. Sporophyte is basically any adult plant. And then the gametophyte are these really strange little fern parts or other parts embedded within the overall sporophyte generation. So it's just a little bit different genetically. So again, the coloration is important here. That grayish blue is the gametophyte. So primitive plants are dominated by gametophyte with only a small sporophyte part. Some plants are completely distinctive, right? So we have the completely distinctive sporophyte and the independent gametophyte. So that's again considered rare. A and B are considered strange, rare, primitive, weird, just very different from human systems, from animalian systems. And then the sporophyte generation is more typical of more evolved, complicated plants and more similar to what we see in humans, where most of your tissue is diploid and then only the reproductive cells that are in the testes and the ovaries that would be the gametophytes, right? So weird things that plants do, they shift between both genetic parts, right? Sporophytes and gametophytes. So more taxonomy here. I'm not doing this justice, right? There's a tremendous number of plant phyla. There's a lot of plant diversity. We're only going to discuss 4 here, right? 4 common plant phyla. So Phylum Bryophyta, which are the mosses, Phylum Pterophyta, which are the ferns, Phylum Coniferophyta, which are the evergreens, and then Phylum Anthophyta, which are the flowering plants. So 4 common phyla that pretty much, I don't know the exact statistical number, but I would say in excess of 85–90% of living plant species would probably fall within one of these 4 phyla. So mosses, right? Bryophyta or Bryophyta, right? Phyta meaning plant. So we know that when we see PHYTA, we're referring to some sort of plant. Mosses are considered plants, but they're considered very primitive plants, right? If you can imagine the progression, the evolutionary progression from algae that are just floating in water. They're not at risk of dehydrating because they're always in water. They don't need structural support because the force of gravity is less if you're just floating, if you're buoyant in water, than if you're on land. So mosses are the first, I guess, attempt at a plant, where now these plants are evolving on land. It's a drier condition. It's gravity has more of an impact in this environment as well. So they're gonna be small, they're gonna be primitive, and they're what we consider to be non-tracheophyte plants. Right? Tracheophyte. Tracheo means tube or pipe. Phyte means plant. Phyta or phyte means plant. And non means without. So these are plants without tubes. So they have no plumbing system, basically. They have no way of soaking up water from the roots. And in fact, they don't actually have roots. So they're, again, a rootless, stemless, leafless plant. But they're still plants, right? Taxonomically, they still fall under the plant kingdom. So if you are a plant with no roots, stems, or leaves, it's going to have a big impact on how and where you grow. So they must grow in areas that are very moist and cool, where there's not so much dehydration, desiccation. So they're really sort of by necessity, they're sort of found only in these humid climates, right? They can't survive in other non-humid type climates. Since they have no stems or roots, they can't grow tall, right? So they kind of spread out like a carpet. So they have this sort of horizontal growth pattern, this carpet-like growth. And again, the first attempt at this new kingdom that we call Plantae. So again, we don't have these types of ecosystems here in El Paso, but this is where we would find moss, right? Moss would be found in very, very humid, cool climates like this. And if you notice, this moss is growing on rocks. And that's fine because they're not trying to send roots into the rocks. They're just kind of covering the surface, and water is literally splashing on them here. So again, just different diversity of moss. There's different species, but they're all going to be that non-tracheophyte, small stature. If you look at the evolutionary progression, what's the next logical step? Well, it's now the development of leaves and roots and stems, right? So we go from the non-tracheophytes, which are the mosses, Bryophyta, to the Tracheophyte anatomy. And the first representative of the tracheophytes are going to be the Pterophytes, right? Pterophyta, which are the ferns. Pterophyta, if you think of pterodactyl, refers to a winged dinosaur, right? So ptero refers to kind of wing, pertains to sort of like feathers. And if you use your imagination, maybe you can see, well, yeah, this kind of looks like a wing or a feather. And that's where they derive their name, right? The Pterophyta. So Pterophyta are still relatively primitive plants. They're not as primitive as moss because they are now tracheophytes, but they're still strange because they have that independent gametophyte, right? So that gametophyte lives outside of the sporophyte body. Since they have that weird gametophyte, they do not produce seeds. They rely on sori for reproduction, right? I'm going to cover what a sorus or sori refers to, right? And again, although they have roots, stems, and leaves, they are still sort of evolutionary linked to cooler, moister, climates. So again, they do require sort of similar habitats to the moss. We don't have a lot of wild occurring ferns out here in El Paso. It's just too hot, too dry. They're not, the dry desert condition is not conducive to a lot of fern growth. So here's just some generic pictures where you would see green, right? Green, we don't see a lot of green here in El Paso, but we see green on the trees. So moss growing on any type of surface that it can adhere to. And then we have ferns down below. So our non-tracheophytes and then our tracheophytes. And these non-tracheophytes are living on the big tracheophyte trees, which we'll get into in a bit. So what is a sori, right? Sorus if it's one, sori if it's many. But sori are little clusters of spores. So on the underside of the fern leaf, frond, these little clusters start to develop, and there's a reason for this type of reproduction. So if I'm a plant, I don't want my offspring to live and grow right beside me. There's going to be competition for light, for water, and the little offspring, the baby's going to have a hard time competing with the big parent, right? So to minimize competition, the parent plant tries to extend the sori or farther out, so they're on the leaves, on the fronds, and then they drop, and they can be carried by water, by wind, whatever the case may be, and it's just a way of dispersing the offspring a little farther. So it's a neat strategy that they use. So if you have maybe there's a fern that grows in your kitchen, I don't know, maybe just check the underside of the leaf, and you might be able to see some of these little spores. They're not always going to be found. It's a very sort of seasonal type of situation. They're not reproductive all year long. So here we have a fern leaf, fern frond, full of these little sori. So very reproductive at this point. So again, two of our primitive types of plants. We look at, again, the moss, the Bryophyta, the ferns, the Pterophyta. Let me elaborate a tiny bit more on the Tracheophyte anatomy, the idea of having now pipes and tubes that is going to enable these plants to move materials up and down. So if a plant is a tracheophyte, it will have two types of what we call vascular tissues, right? So these vascular tissues, which are xylem and phloem. Again, I'm keeping this very superficial. I'm not, we could go into a lot more depth. Just kind of simplifying some stuff here, but xylem and phloem tissue making up then the tracheophyte anatomy. So, well, I'll come back to this in a bit. So when we look at then the idea of being a tracheophyte, you know, we have two types of vascular tissues. Why do we have two types of vascular tissues? Well, because the plant is going to be having to move two very different types of liquids, fluids. So one type of transport is water. So water is sort of extracted from the ground, and then water has to be moved upwards against the force of gravity to the upper part of the tree, the plant, the fern, to the leaves. Right? So we need a plumbing system, a pipe, a tube that's going to be able to move water up. We're going to need a separate, distinctive type of plumbing system, a pipe or tube that's going to move sugar, the product of photosynthesis, down to the roots. So we have basically a singular organism, but there's very, very different in the two parts, right? We have the underground sort of terrestrial form, always in the dark, no leaves. Its main task is to pick up water. That's the sort of the responsibility of the roots. In the upper part, right, the canopy, we have then the tree, the fern, whatever, but we have the leaves, different temperature, more sun, more wind, more dry conditions. So again, very, very different parts, these different parts of the same plant being subjected to very, very different types of sort of micro climatic conditions, if you will. So two vascular tissues for the movement of water and also the movement of sugars. Right? Now, depending on the type of plant that we're discussing, the type of species, some plants are gonna basically live only 1 year, right? They're annual. So you think, well, if you're only gonna live 1 year, if you knew you had 1 year to survive, it's gonna have an impact on what you do, how you spend that year. So these plants that are going to live only for that season spend a lot of time in the reproductive mode. They produce flowers and they do all this other stuff, but they don't worry about putting a lot of transport tissue, right? So the plants that are going to live for multiple years, like these trees and other species that are long-lived, they're going to have to worry about, hey, we need a really good foundation. We need to have a very good system of moving water and sugar. So they're going to be putting a much greater emphasis on the vascular tissue. Right? So a difference in plant structure here. Well, let's look at our first vascular tissue, which is what we're going to call xylem tissue. Right? Xylem tissue is basically dead. It's dead, hollow cells that are going to help move water upwards by the sort of chemical process that we call capillary action, right? From the realm of physics and chemistry, the movement of the polar water molecules up against the force of gravity. So think of xylem like little straws, right? Where they're able to move water upwards, and they are dead. They have to be dead and hollow for them to function. Phloem tissue is living tissue, right? And it's going to have to move sugar, glucose, right? Sticky, viscous material with the help of gravity, right? From the leaves downwards to the roots. So xylem only functions when it's dead. Phloem only functions when it is alive. So two very, very distinctive types of tissues here. And if we cut a fern stem or a tree, we can start to see all these rings. Right? These rings basically give us an idea as to what is happening in the life of the plant, right? Where you see a lot of thick layer here. Get this, we see a thick layer. We know that, wow, that plant grew a lot that season. And then when we see a thin layer, we see, oh, that plant became a little bit dormant. So we can estimate the age of the plant looking at summer growth, winter dormancy, summer growth, winter dormancy, summer growth, winter dormancy. And it just gives us an idea of how old that plant is. And you can't do this with every species, but some of the large trees that add a lot of xylem tissue you can do this with. So we notice that the bulk of the stem is xylem tissue. So that means most of the inside of the plant is dead tissue. We have this sort of green layer on the outside that is the living component of the plant, right? So we have dead tissue on the inside, a ring of life, and then we have maybe dead protective bark tissue on the outside. So it's kind of weird, but most of a plant, if you see these huge trees, most of that huge tree is dead, right? We have the living phloem and then the living leaves, but most of that stem and trunk would be then dead tissue. So they cut a tree there. So my chainsaw noise, right? They cut the tree, and basically we see all this dead xylem tissue. Here they call it wood. If you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you ask them for xylem tissue, they're not gonna know what you're talking about, right? But xylem tissue is basically wood and lumber. And if we grind this to a pulp and we make napkins, surprise, surprise, napkins are very good at picking up moisture because they are comprised of this xylem tissue that is evolutionarily designed to pick up and move water. So all the dead xylem tissue. And then we have in this picture the living phloem, which is now this yellow, that yellow ring around the body of the trunk of the plant. So dead on the inside, kind of sad, huh, to say that the plants are dead on the inside, right? But they're pretty much dead on the inside, a little living ring on the outside, and then the dead bark also on the outside. So we know plants are very different than humans, yeah? So if we think, well, how do we share anything at all with plants? Well, maybe it might surprise you a little bit, but if we use our imagination a little bit, just like we have arteries that are sending blood away from the heart, veins that are bringing blood back to the heart, we have two types of movements of circulation, of vessel types. Well, plants also do something similar, right? They have all this series of vessels and different xylem and phloem tissues for the movement of these different types of fluids. Now, a lot of insects have figured this out as well. Yeah? So if you're a hungry beetle, little insect that has figured this out, and if you figure out, well, if I can kind of burrow through this dead tissue, I can get to that sugary substance on the inside. Right? And humans have figured this out as well. So if you're a fan of maple syrup is basically that, right? So these maple farmers sort of drill that little hole in there, they puncture that phloem layer, and as the sucrose or the glucose or the sap, the syrup is coming down, it will drain and be collected into these buckets, right? So we have to be a little bit conscious of this. If too many holes are drilled onto the tree and not enough glucose makes it down to the roots, then the roots may start potentially dying off, and that will kill the whole tree. So again, just the knowledge of plant anatomy has allowed us to then extract this very sweet maple syrup. This bug has done the same thing. It punctured through, and now all this glucose syrup is running down its little body there. So with that will conclude our first discussion on plants, right? The Bryophyta and the Pterophyta. So I have to cover next the Pterophyta, which is not too long. And then we have a couple of sort of variations on the Anthophyta. So there'll be a couple more presentations. Keep an eye out for those, and I'll get those posted as soon as I can. Right? So y'all have a good time reviewing this video, learn what you can, and keep an eye out for the next ones. And I'll be seeing you shortly.